That making a video about idealism is pretty much on point, considering how many modern currents of thought are, if not directly, heavily influenced by certain idealistic principles, particularly Hegel's ideas of dialectic, and all of that are inherent in many philosophical systems that we deal with daily. I mean, if you look at Marxism, and if you look at certain branches of Marxism, like, for example, of the gender theory, you can clearly see the repetition of Hegelian cliches about how we reach a real self through our alienation from ourselves. The more we alienate ourselves, the more we distantiate ourselves from ourselves, the more we find our own true identity. Right? This is basically the fundamental assumption of gender theory. And so, what was the main goal of idealists? Why did they pop up in this, late 18th century Germany? Well, idealists were basically focused on what they considered to be a necessary correction of Kant. Kant was surely right in assessing the falsity of the human worldview, which is so-called associationism, that states that basically all these perceptions we have floating around ourselves are somehow magically gathered in the same place, without no directing scope or force. And Kant said, well, we cannot assume that if we don't presume the existence of a place, which is the ego, but also we have to presume that the ego is fit for the gathering of these perceptions. So the ego has to have so-called noumena, so the containers of perceptions, so in order to properly comprehend them. So idealists say, well, that's good, but Kant doesn't imply that space and time also should be part of the ego, right? Kant thought that space and time are external to the ego, are external conditions, are not directly dependent on the state of affairs of myself. But the idealists say, well, then we are creating a very dangerous and world-breaking dichotomy between me and the external universe. How does Hegel resolve this problem? So for Hegel, being is thought. What does that mean? Well, it means that the only way I have to relate myself to reality is to return to a basic principle of identity, saying I am I, or I am myself. That is the basis of all epistemological claims, and that has to be assumed transcendentally. This is something Hegel clearly agrees with under a Cartesian standpoint. But Hegel goes forth, saying that we cannot remain there, because if I say just that being is me acknowledging to be, then there is no progression, then there's no becoming, there's no history, there's nothing. I'm just like a blank, bleak piece of paper with nothing written on it. So I had to presume a chain of reactions after this principle. Otherwise, it's not principle of anything, by definition. So Hegel says that in order to have a progression, I have to have an antithesis to me posing myself as being. And of course, the antithesis to that would be non-being, and not me at the same time. So the union between being and non-being is becoming. And the process that relates them internally is called dialectic. It's a very famous point of Hegel's worldview. So Hegel very famously thought that dialectic not only stays within the realm of thought in the narrowest sense, but it's something that permeates the whole world. I mean, even the universe is subject to dialectic, even evolution, even mutations in nature and everywhere are subject to that law. So what that law actually decrees is that in order to be myself, I have to alienate myself, to estrange myself, to a degree that I cannot recognize myself, otherwise I cannot affirm myself. You see how this dialectic is the basis for modern gender theory, right? Basically, it's all, which is Marxism. Of course, Marxism is left-wing Hegelianism, so it's not a surprise at all. So, Hegel says the non-being, the moment of science called non-being, is immediate. There is no mediation internal to non-being. So non-being has an automatic perception of itself being just a face. Right? And it's clear the reason why Hegel says that, because if non-being was mediated by something, namely being, then non-being would be an illusion. Because non-being would be just a copy of being. But non-being has to be totally independent from being, therefore it has to be immediate. But now a basic problem arises. First of all, if the object outside of me is just me, then when the object changes, it's just me annihilating myself in the object. But that implies that there's no knowledge of the object. There's no epistemological ground for any knowledge of an external object, because it keeps implying my annihilation. So the second problem that stems directly from this one, that is not resolvable under a Hegelian standpoint, of course, is that how can I, if I annihilate myself totally in non-being, find myself back into being? Because if I annihilate myself relatively, then I could find myself back into being. But if that was the case, again, that would violate Hegel's view that non-being is immediate. There's no being quality to non-being. It's pure and absolute and antithetical non-being. So this is what Hegel calls the rejection of the law of non-contradiction. And in the Science of Logic, Hegel even attempts a logical, or rather a metalogical demonstration for that. He says that when I say A equals A under a classical logic, under a standpoint of classical logic, that would be a tautology, so that's a blind spot, that's a blind alley. I don't go anywhere from there. But under his speculative logic, he calls it speculative logic. It's not a tautology anymore, because when I pose A equals, I'm implying that I'm searching for something other than A. But then, since I'm repeating A, I'm reverting back to A. But even if that was true, how does that say to us that we are actually finding an antithesis to A? There's no need for that. I mean, I can say that A is man, and I say man equals, I can say man equals Socrates. But Socrates is not an antithesis to man. Socrates is a man. He's an individual substance, as Aristotle would say, so he's a subproduct of the universal man. So I agree that if we say, well, being is A, therefore we cannot find anything else but non-being, that's fine. But not everything applies to that. I mean, only these very general concepts apply to that kind of logic, but individual substances don't. Like determined being totally eschew Hegel's logic. This is pretty problematic. Hegel actually employs a Fichtean paradigm. Fichte was another idealist philosopher who lived prior to the publication of the Science of Logic, and Fichte was the first one to assert this dichotomy between difference, identity and difference, and to kind of allude to the fact that identity should imply difference, which is something, again, pretty vague that doesn't work, because it's when we just put all of this within the scope of human thought, we really don't go anywhere. That would work if we supposed a divine mind in which the gap between unity and multiplicity is resolved automatically, right? But in the historical framework Fichte and Hegel posit, man, the whole thing doesn't work. And it really goes down to this logical impossibility, that it's not evitable in any ways. So again, if I am alienated into the other, and this is the phase of antithesis, the phase of alienating myself into difference, which is necessary, according to Fichte and Hegel, to assert myself back. If I am in the other, I cannot see myself. So it's either that I'm not sufficiently alienated, right, so that I can recognize myself back, or that I'm so alienated that I'm oblivious of myself. I mean, this is the same problem that Fichte and Hegel have. I mean, but Hegel particularly translates this problem in ontological terms, making it even worse. I mean, if the phase of antithesis is immediate, as we have just pointed out, therefore it's not like influenced nor managed by the thesis, which is the being, what will reconduct consciousness in itself the moment consciousness goes into non-being?